welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and round 11 of the AFL season has been run and won, and it was a huge round in the fantasy world with some seriously good scores, and I'm sure there were some massive team scores across your leagues. Hopefully you were the coach of some of them. We had 21 players score over 120 after only 11 did the same thing last week. And of the 21, 11 went 130 plus, and we actually had 66 players ton up for the week, up from 43 last week. But was the footy itself any good? I thought it was a pretty alright weekend. We had a high-scoring thriller on Thursday night with Bailey Smith welcoming his old club, the Bulldogs, down to Geelong for the night. And that was a tight finish, but that was kind of it for the close ones until the very last game of the round as the Saints tried in vain to pull back the Suns at Marvel, but fell 19 points short. So perhaps the increase in margins of all the games contributed to a higher fantasy scoring round. Not sure what caused it, but there has definitely been a few weeks where we've had nothing but close finishes, and now we have a weekend where there's a lot of one-sided games and the fantasy scoring went through the roof. We've got a massive episode this week. Massive. As I start with running through the things I noticed, I'll then have my waiver wire pickups as usual, but with something a little extra this week that I'm going to add to that segment moving forward. I'll also touch on the new dual position player changes that most formats saw land on Sunday night. Plus I've got some questions, some trades to go through and review sent in by you, the listener. Yeah, packed episode, so I reckon let's just get stuck into it and look at the things I noticed across round 11. And starting in Geelong on Thursday night, I'll tell you something I noticed. I noticed Tom Stewart was back in the side for the Cats, and he looked like his usual Tom Stewart self. It was a great return for him, for owners. It's been quite the rollercoaster owning him the last few years. But he's back now, and in a year where defenders have been hard to find, he's safe as houses. Shannon Neal is someone who I've really been enjoying his development this year, and I guess tail end of last year as well. But this is the game that will make others take notice. I think it was probably his best game, kicked 5 goals, and was really crucial to the Cats. And, he joins a long list of players that I see as quite appealing in keeper leagues as key forwards who can score at least a 70. And there's been a whole bunch of them this year develop, and I think he's one of them. Jeremy Cameron, now there's a guy in hot form. 13 goals in his last 2 games, and he just looks in unbelievable touch. His form around the goals the last 2 weeks has been incredible. And, he's at a stage of his career where I didn't think we'd be seeing his best footy, but I reckon he's come pretty close to it in the last few weeks. Now, a couple of different Cats fans I've spoken to in the last couple of days have said, with Dangerfield out of that forward line, Jezza looks a lot freer and, possibly the reason why he's been playing so well the last 2 weeks. So it's a tricky one for the Cats because Danger's been a revelation forward this year. But if he's not there and Jeremy Cameron does that, I think that maybe Danger does need to get up the ground when he's back. For the Bulldogs, Ed Richards, I just think deserves some recognition. He's a guy I've actually got in my home league who for the last few years has been exciting and building. Then he got the midfield role, which was good. Lost defender status, which I was okay with. But I just feel like he's been an 80 to 90 guy for such a long time. And I was starting to wonder if he could go to the next level. And look, he may not actually get to that next level, but right now the form he's in, he's got 4 tons in a row. 5 of the last 6 have been tons. And in those 6 games, he's kicked goals in every game. So he's a midfielder kicking goals. And that's what Ed Richards owners have been waiting for, and hopefully it continues. Friday night we saw the Bombers and the Tigers do battle in the annual Dreamtime game, and it was a great game for, well, look, people probably wouldn't call it a great game. It was certainly quite a stark difference in the skills between the Thursday night game and the Friday night game, but I thought it was a pretty entertaining game nonetheless. And the Tigers, they were right there with them until the last quarter. So for the Tigers, Luke Traynor is someone who has been quite a revelation in the fantasy world. I don't think anyone expected him to have the impact he's had so far, but the Tigers do continue to experiment with him and pull surprises, like when he was named the sub 5-6 weeks ago, like when he was subbed out of the game last week, and now this week they've put him in the forward line. And he saw little action. It just wasn't a game for him, and had a very bad score. So I hope that Richmond just say, okay, we had a look at it, let's get him back where he scores fantasy points, and that's in the back line. Speaking of backline fantasy points, Sam Banks, come on down. Is this Jaden Short 2.0? He has looked brilliant in Short's absence the last few weeks. Playing that halfback role, he was just everywhere on Friday night, and he had a great score last week, but to put up a 110 this week, I think it's pretty exciting if you jumped on. He now has defender status. We'll talk about that a bit later as well. Now, Floston took the majority of the kick-ins, but it didn't matter. Banks was great. So the question is, when Jaden Short returns, what does that role look like for Banks, and what does his fantasy output look like? So I think he's going to be okay, and I think eventually he will be the next Jaden Short. But I really do want to have a look at the two of them together and see if they can both score. Kane McAuliffe has put back-to-back good scores together playing in that midfield, and he's just a guy that's been around a few years, and it's time. It's time he stepped up to the level, has looked really good, in that midfield, and I think that will continue. So good signs for McAuliffe owners. Now, the Tigers rested Nankervis. I think he was rested, or he had some sort of niggle. And we got to look at Samson Ryan as the number one ruck. And I've got to say, he looked okay. I thought he looked okay up against, would have been Goldstein. But no, he looked all right. And I know he's been not much maligned, but I know Tigers fans have been frustrated with his young career so far. But perhaps there's a spot for him in the ruck down the track when Nankervis is out. But I thought he looked okay. I didn't mind it. For the Bombers, it was a scoring extravaganza. That last quarter, particularly when the Tigers completely fell away. There were 4 Essendon players who scored over 40 points in that last quarter. That was Martin, Merritt, Caldwell and Dersma. So they just went ape. And no one went more ape than Nick Martin in that last quarter, with 69 points to finish the game in the last quarter, which was enough to get him, for the second time in 3 weeks, the Finders Keepers Player of the Week. And I've been trying not to give it to the same player twice, but I could not look past the performance of Nick Martin. 26 kicks, 9 handballs, 9 marks, 8 tackles and 2 goals. And as I said, absolutely feasted in that last quarter, finishing with a 166 if you don't mind. Incredible. He is becoming an absolute fantasy freak. I wish I had him in my sides. Angus Clark had a really impressive debut for the Bombers. Geez, they've gone through a few debuts in recent times with all those injuries. And I still don't know a lot about this guy, but geez, as far as impressive debuts go, he just looked great, didn't he? He kicked 3 goals, including, I think, 2 in the first half when the game was pretty close. And I couldn't get a read of whether he's going to be a fantasy guy or not, but to score, what was it, 98 or something on debut, I dare say there'll be a fair few plucking him off the waiver wires this week. I would like just to have another look at him and just see, what sort of player is he going to be, because that was very exciting. Loved the panning to his family in the crowd too every time he did something. It's great. That's what you love about the footy. On to the Saturday game where we saw the Blues take on the Giants, and the Giants were just too good in the end and won a game they really needed to. Fair bit to cover off in this game. Sam Doherty at half-back. Is that right? That's exciting. I mean, we thought about that in pre-season. Once Nick Newman went down, the logical replacement we all thought was Doherty didn't eventuate as the season started. And then he was in the twos for a bit, back and forth, and now he's back in, and that's a big score. 30 touches, appearing to play off half-back. Jeez, it's pretty exciting. Cooper Lord is a guy I've talked about a lot, and it was great to see another awesome game from him. Still only minimal CBAs. I talked about last week how I thought the Blues would be smarter to put him in the middle a little bit more, just for a bit of variance from that same, Walsh, Cripps, Hewitt sort of dynamic that they've got. And they gave him a few this week, Lord, but still not a heap. Anyway, a good score from him, 87. And I think if you haven't jumped on him by now, and he's still around, go and get him. George Hewitt, I'm afraid the party's over. I've been seeing in the last few weeks a bit of a drop-off in his scoring. As we know, he started the season like a Tom Mitchell in his heyday, with 7 tons to start the season. And it's just dropped off ever since. And then on the weekend, he delivered a really bad score for owners. And I believe he was running with Tom Green in a tagging role. And, that's fine. But when you score I think it was a 40, so it was awful. Really, really poor. So, yeah, interesting to see if he can bounce back next week. But it feels like a long time ago for George Hewitt owners that he was the only player on the ton run. For the Giants, Toby Green, in his milestone game, I think it was game 250, he had a huge game, as not surprisingly, but that midfield role continued and looked even better this time. And he was a huge reason the Giants got over the line. I wasn't sure if this midfield role would continue just with his, he's an older guy now, and they've got other guys that they need to develop through there. But, if the Giants are hanging on to this season, which they are, I reckon he stays in that role for the time being, and that's very good news for Toby Green owners. The midfield mix was really fascinating ahead of this game for the Giants because of the injuries that they've got. And they had a few more out, I think, last week. I just was really interested to see who were the main centre bounce guys. I thought Toby Green would be one of them. I mean, he has been for a few weeks, and it makes sense that he was even more involved. Now, Xavier O'Halloran has had a bit of a taste of CBAs in the past, and last week he had it in the last quarter and scored okay. So this week he got a really good run and he scored a 90-something, which I think we've all sort of noticed O'Halloran with that forward status and thought, oh, that could be handy. He's just never really shown any sort of scoring pedigree. But that changed on the weekend, and hopefully it's a sign of things to come for him, and he'd be quite available on a lot of waiver wires as well. The other guy who got a taste of CBAs was Darcy Jones, and I love this from the Giants. I've really been a fan of his every time I watch him this year. Just whenever he's near the ball, it's an exciting thing to watch. So it makes sense. Chuck that kid in the guts and see if he can get some clearances. And he had a pretty good score too. I'm not convinced that role stays, but it's just good to see the Giants trying different things. And, if any of those roles sort of stick, those players become so much more relevant to us. Lachie Whitfield had an interesting day. The Classic world was up in arms when the game started because he was playing in a forward role and he didn't really get much of the pill. Now, as the game went on, he ended up getting the ball and scoring okay. In fact, he got to 80 in the end, which is pretty good if that's a bad game. So I reckon he probably ended up going back to his original role in the second half maybe, but there's a very interesting stat in this game. For the first time since round 23, 2022, Lachie Whitfield didn't take a kick in for the Giants. It was predominantly Lachie Ash that transition is well in place of Whitfield handing the baton over to Lachie Ash for the future, and Lachie Ash owners would be loving what they're seeing. So what will we see with the Giants this week? Will Whitfield be in the forward line again? I doubt it. I'm sure he'll go back to his original role, his normal role. He'll be taking kick-ins again. He'll probably put up a huge score. But again, it's just interesting to see the Giants trying some different things as they deal with a lot of outs that they've got through injury. Hawthorn took on Brisbane at the G in the other Saturday game, and the Lions were just too good. I felt like for the first time watching Hawthorn this year, they looked a bit flat. And I just wonder if they're getting a little tired as we approach the byes. But full credit to Brisbane. They just keep getting it done, don't they? Not a lot sort of stood out in this game for me. Connor McDonald had a good score, which would be pleasing for owners. He hasn't had a great season, but you know what? I actually thought that, and then I went and looked at his scores for the season. There's been some stinkers, but he's actually been okay. So, yeah, good to see him hit a nice ton there. And for the Lions, I mean, Dev Robertson, it's just good to see him get a game. He was the sub and he barely got any minutes, but just good to see he's still about. I think we're all waiting for him to get some regular games or, more likely change clubs at the end of the year and find a home that will play him. But forward status, I think we're all expecting good things from him, but needs to get on the park at some point. And it was nice to see the Lions give him, 5 or 10 minutes on the weekend. And Zach Bailey, nothing really other than just to comment that good season continues. I mean, he's on track for a season high, career high average in fantasy this season. I don't know what's changed. I think he's playing his usual role, but he's just doing it really well and adding some pretty good scores. I think he's hit the ton maybe 2 or 3 times this year. So I think it's pretty good for Zach Bailey owners who, after a few years may have just been a little bit over the 70s that he would inevitably put out. And, maybe he can get that average over 80 this year, which would be, a great average for any forward. Saturday night, we saw North Melbourne and Collingwood, and this was quite an entertaining game. Collingwood had so many outs that you couldn't help but give North a chance. And North were decent for a few quarters at least, but Collingwood kept them in the game by their awful shooting for goal, kicked a lot of points. Anyway, much like the Tigers on Friday night, the Roos just completely fell away in the last quarter and Collingwood got it done. Now, Ned Long has been a great player this year who, has got another chance at the game and is now locked away a spot in that Collingwood midfield. I've really enjoyed him this year. One thing I hadn't expected was a score like that on the weekend. So he's really added a ceiling to his game, scoring a 130-something. And a lot of that was tackles, of course. He's a big tackle player, but yeah, if he's now got a 130 in his arsenal, his value is just growing week by week. Ed Allen got a nice score as well, playing on a wing. And, it's exciting and there's been a lot of talk about Allen and it's great to see him post a 90-plus score. But, geez, the reality is Sidebottom and Pendlebury and all these guys are going to come back in. I think I saw today there's at least 4 players to come back for the Pies this week. So, geez, he's going to be stiff, Allen, but, he might be one of the ones to make way. But just for the future, you can see he can score. Harry Perryman, that was his biggest CBA game of the season for the Pies, but the scoring, it just doesn't look like being there, does it? You know, he's playing that defensive mid role, and yeah, I mean, he scored 71, which is great, but yeah, I think people who were stocks in on him at the start of the year would be pretty frustrated at the moment, to say the least. For North, some pretty exciting names here. Dylan Stevens has been building to this score for a bit now. It's his first fantasy ton since round 1 2023, when he was a Swan. So his first ton as a Kangaroo, playing on the wing. I just saw him all over the ground. It was a really good performance, and I hope, you know, it's time that he starts to show what we've all been thinking is possible for him. And then for North themselves to unearth him as a really good wing player would be it'd be super helpful for them. Riley Hardiman. Now this was exciting. I was speaking about him a few weeks ago on this podcast, saying the scoring's not there, but just watch him, because he's got a bit of fantasy in him. And what a breakout performance we saw. His first fantasy ton. No Sheasel in the back line. He was more forward and a bit in the midfield. And Hardiman was everywhere. He had a huge first quarter, and then he just kept going and got to the ton. So pretty sure he'll get a mention a bit later when I go through my top waiver pickups. And then the last one, Jacob Constanti, who, you know, he's not posting huge numbers, but I just like what I'm seeing with him. He's playing, I think, half forward. Yeah, every time I see him, every week I see him, he's improving. I just wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this season, we're looking at him as a fantasy guy. The other Saturday night game was the Dockers and the Power, and yeah, Freo got it done in the end with a pretty unfortunate injury very early in the game. Young Cooper Simpson, who'd been looking pretty good off half back, he what was the injury? I think it was a shoulder. It's a bad one. I think he's having surgery, and yeah, I don't think we'll see him again this season. And it was just an interesting thing I noticed was Bailey Banfield was the sub, and he came on for Simpson, but instead of going to his usual forward role and maybe Freo push someone like Wagner back from the midfield to the back line, they actually played Banfield in Simpson's role in the half back line, and he scored 86, which is pretty good. So I don't know what Freo's plans are this week, but I do know that if he's named up in that backline Banfield, well, he's shown already he can score in just over 3.5 quarters of footy. For Port Adelaide, Miles Bergman continues his midfield role with an 88, which was great to see. I was worried he'd have to go back to his old role with all the outs that Port had. But, you know, they brought in guys like Rory Atkins and a couple other names like that and kept Bergman in the guts. Him and Drew did tagging roles on Sarong and Brayshaw, and I think that's what Bergman offers. He can run with the opposition's best player and score fantasy points doing it. He's a very, it's an exciting prospect, Bergman. I hope Port keep doing what they're doing. Rory Atkins, as I mentioned, came in, and I reckon that would have been his first game at Port Adelaide without a sub vest. And, you know, played half back, racked up the pill as he can. Logan Evans also did the same. He's been in the side for a few weeks now, and he looked great in the role late last year. Has been very up and down this year. So Atkins and Evans both scored nice, I think 80 plus in that role. It's just hard to know if it continues for either of them, let alone both. So I find it really hard to pick what's going to happen there. Clearly in a keeper league, if you're looking at the two, it's the youth of Logan Evans. But, you know, Atkins might get a run as well. We'll wait and see what Port Adelaide do there. On to Sunday, and Adelaide got the job done against West Coast in Adelaide. I was pretty happy with this result as a Crows fan. West Coast pushed the Crows in that first half, particularly early, and the Crows looked a little bit too casual with some of their short kicks, and yeah, there were a lot of frustrating turnovers. But anyway, Crows got going in the second half and ended up with a big win. A few players to talk about in this game, including, I'm going to call him my boy. Anyone who knows me knows I've been a big Sam Berry fan for many years. And I put the tweet out on Sunday, I think it was Sunday morning, saying, is this the game where Sam Berry gets 4 quarters? And it was, and I may be biased, but I reckon he looked pretty good. So he played full game, midfield, and then he actually spent a bit of time deep forward, as we saw a few little things like that for the Crows, because Taylor Walker was out, rested. So we saw Berry spend a bit of time. I mean, there were a couple of times I think he started out of the square, which was unusual for him. But he looked great in the midfield and played the way he's played as the sub in the last 4 weeks, coming on and impacting and winning clearances. So it was great to see a big score out of him. Josh Rochelle, he's really starting to hit his straps now. There's been a lot said about him and, the end to last year where the Crows dropped him for disciplinary reasons, and there was a lot of hoo-ha about whether they should have done that or not, and he might want to go home now and request a trade. Nah, this kid he just put his head down and bum up, worked hard in the off-season, and is really starting to look good. 5 goals is a great result for him, and he's had a little bit of a taste of the centre bounces the last few weeks as well, but I think his best work is going to be done ahead of the ball in that forward 50. His goal sense is excellent. Riley Thilthorpe was always set for a big game, just coming up against a young West Coast defence, no Tex, and no McGovern for the Eagles. And he was great. I'd like to see him kick a bit straighter. Just feel like he needs to kick a bag at some point. He kicked 2 or 3. But what stood out to me was he seemed to have a little bit more time in the ruck this week than usual. And I reckon part of that was Riley O'Brien played a little bit forward just to cover that Tex absence. Anyway, Thilthorpe played, it was the most ruck contests he attended for the season. Not by much, but just a little bit. And it was just great to see a little bit more of him around the footy in the middle of the ground as well, as watching him do what he does best in the forward line, and that's clunk marks and sometimes kick straight. For West Coast, it was a very, very low-scoring fantasy game for them. Jack Graham was their best with 75, and I think that came off 8 tackles to get there. Brady Hoff, that was a super disappointing score, 43. And he's done this a bit, hasn't he? Since the Eagles gave him this midfield role, 1 week I'm here saying, hey, this guy's going to be great, get him. And then he drops a 40 the next week. So I said last week, if you get Hoff in, just keep him in, because you're going to see these scores. They're going to frustrate you. Get him on your bench if you can. But the role is there, and they are sticking with it, it seems. It's just some weeks he's not touching the ball. But he will. He'll bounce back this week, I'm sure. Ryan Marrick, he had his bubble burst a little bit. His first really bad fantasy game since he's taken this role in the back line. And for the first time since round 6, he didn't take the most kick-ins. Liam Duggan stepped up this week and took plenty. So Marrick scored 51. I feel he got stuck with too much responsibility on some of the Crows' big guys, and I reckon he bounces back this week as well. Melbourne did a number on Sydney in another of the Sunday games. Really big win for the Demons, and they're starting to build. As for the Swans, well, a disappointing first season under Dean Cox continues, but they're not licked yet, and there's still plenty of the season to go, and it is Sydney after all. Now for the Demons, well, there were some big scores in this game. It was a very high-scoring fantasy game, and, where do you even start? I mean, Max Gawn what a season he's having. He had a career season last year, and I thought there's no way he's going to be able to even match that this year. He's got to start going backwards. But another massive 140 on the weekend up against his old mate Brodie Grundy. He's just a freak, Gorney. Christian Salem had another big score for him. He's had a couple of these big ones throughout the year. He took 11 marks, cruising around the ground, and he even had 7 centre bounce attendances. So he was everywhere. But as good as any of them were, nothing came close to the midfield masterclass that Keziah Pickett put up. This isn't the first time he's kicked 5 goals in a game as a midfielder this season, I don't think. So he was everywhere, real bulk midfield time, plenty of centre bounces, kicked 5 goals for, and geez, when he plays like this, he is just on another level, isn't he? Very exciting score for owners. Clayton Oliver owners, I reckon, sighed a huge sigh of relief because that was his best game in a very long time. We know the story with Oliver and what's happened in the last couple of years, but it's just, it's good to see him bounce back. First time he's had 30 touches in a game since round 4, and 12 tackles was huge. Helped him on the way to a big score, which, like I said, his owners would be so desperate for. Jake Bowie, owners might be a little disappointed that he only scored a 63 when, guys like Salem were going ape, but it's a pretty big, there's a pretty big moment in his career, I reckon, because Sydney sent James Jordan to him. So if you're copping the James Jordan tag, that says a fair bit about your stature in the game and the way you impact. So I think this is great for Bowie. He'll learn from the tag. I reckon the tag moved at halftime because of Petrarca was doing some good things and Bowie got himself to a 63. But if you're an owner, don't fret, don't worry. He'll be better for that. For Sydney, Angus Sheldrick, my hero last week, he did again this week. Another 4 quarters, another really strong game in that midfield. He had the second most disposals for Sydney, but he didn't take a mark for the whole game. And you can look at that one of 2 ways. One, well, that's obviously really bad, not to take a mark. Or 2, he's scored another 86, I reckon, just by getting the ball and tackling. So as he gets better and he builds his tank and he starts taking marks around the ground as well, I'm telling you, this guy is going to be a fantasy gun. He's building. Brodie Grundy deserves a shout out. That's 3 tons in a row, I think, now for him. And just a massive one here, 134 up against, his old mate Gorney. Just giving him a mention because, owners would have experienced some concerns earlier this year when the scoring was a little bit so-so. Just nice to see the big fella still has some big scores in him. Callum Mills made his long awaited return to the AFL game after a very long time out. And those owners who held him all this time would have been itching to see him. He started pretty well, but faded as the game went on. Had a handful of centre bounces, took some kick-ins, so I think he ended up in the back line again. Scored okay, but, actually I saw today he's been suspended for a week, so he'll miss next week, which I just feel for the Mills owners. I've got him in one of my keepers, actually. I traded him in the summer, thinking how clever am I. I didn't think it would be until round 11 till we saw him. Taylor Adams started as the sub as expected, but did pretty well when he came on. Had plenty of centre bounces in that last quarter particularly. Scored 30-odd points in just over a quarter, and I just think you can do a lot worse than grabbing him and having him sit there on your bench, because if he can build into the season, well, we know how good a scorer he was in the old days, and I don't expect that again. But if he's there and he's getting midfield minutes, he'll score okay. And then lastly, Braden Campbell. I just noticed they threw him into the midfield in the last quarter. and he scored pretty well. So, he's a funny player that I think early days we thought was half back. He's been playing forward this year, and now we've seen a little bit of them wanting to put him in the midfield. I like him. I reckon he's a great player if the role's there. It's just hard to see him get that role with the amount of half-back guys that the Swans have unearthed. But hey, if he's in the midfield, I'm going to keep an eye on him. And then the final game, St Kilda and Gold Coast at Marvel in front of a pretty low crowd. But yeah, Gold Coast did what they had to do, win on the road. That's been their Achilles heel in recent years, and they got it done. And the Saints, well, I don't think they were disgraced, but I'm sure their fans are pretty frustrated with what they're seeing. For the Suns, Bodie Hewland, I talked about him last week, having more of a freer role and seeming to score a bit more, be less locked down. Didn't he go on with it this week? He was on 52 at quarter time in this game and clearly slowed after that. But my goodness, 52 at quarter time. I reckon Noble was a bit quieter in that first quarter and Newland was just taking everything. Joel Jeffrey joined in with Newland. He racked up a 118 score, the second biggest in his career. And I reckon it's time we really start to give this guy some attention. This halfback role continues and he's scoring up and down at times, but now we're seeing a ceiling and we are seeing a bit of consistency out of him. The Gold Coast halfbacks, it's so hard to pick from week to week which one will be the one. And John Noble's been the one all year, but yeah, I like what Jeffrey's doing at the moment. For St Kilda, I knew there'd be a bit of a shake-up in that midfield. Who was out from last week? Something changed last week. Oh, of course, McRae. Jackson McRae's out. And they dropped Garcia. So I knew there'd be some minutes there for someone in the midfield and was really curious to see what it looked like. And it was pretty interesting. Wanganeen Miller, who's had a fair bit of midfield time this year, he played purely in the back line, 0 CBAs to him, and only 3 to Jack Sinclair, who's another guy they like in the middle. So him and Wanganeen Miller were just doing their thing in the back line and scoring beautifully. So then who came in? Marcus Windhager came in, which I've been calling for because I think he's a really good on-baller and offers a lot, and I was surprised he hadn't been in there for a few weeks. So he came in, he looked okay. Zach Jones came into the side. Hunter Clark came into the side. Remember Hunter Clark? He's still around, and he stood out of a lot of them. 10 tackles and a 93 from him. The fingers, toes, and everything else crossed that Hunter Clark can stay on the park and keep his body right, because I think there's a fantasy guy right there, just needs a bit of luck. Hugh Boxall was recalled to the side after some good VFL form, and in my opinion, I was a little bit, I reckon he was a bit stiff to be out of the side to start with. But yeah, he came on as the sub late in the third, had plenty of time in the midfield and scored pretty well. So, I don't know. I reckon Saints just play him. Keep playing him. Mitch Owens is the last player I'll talk about, and he just continues to look more and more like the 2023 version of him that we all enjoyed back then. After a really poor year last year, he's been building this season, playing, as a chop-out ruck, which still seems crazy to me, but he's taller than he looks, Owens. And his scoring is on the up. A nice ton on the weekend, which was a just reward for owners who've held him through the bad times. See what he can do in the second half of the season. On to my top waiver picks for this week. And something new I introduced last week was having a look back at the week before at the players I'd recommended and just seeing how they went. One, because, if they went well, I'd like to remind everyone I told you to get him. But also, if they didn't go well, what do you do with them? Chuck them straight back in the pool and try someone else, or persevere? So let's look at last week. I recommended Angus Sheldrick, who did well again, an 86. Midfield role, 4 quarters, tick, 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 tick. No marks, as I mentioned, but hey, I think he's on track. Brady Hoff was one I mentioned last week. Again, good role, but another very stinky score. I reckon hold him, because there's every chance he'll just score well next week, and then you'll say, oh, get him back, and just hold him. Let's see what happens with him in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Cooper Lord was another one I mentioned. He keeps improving, scored an 87. Taylor Adams, I did flag that he'd probably be the sub, but is worth grabbing just to have. And yeah, he looked pretty good when he came on, scored 32 in a midfield role in just over a quarter of footy. And then the last one, Neil Erasmus. And the role was good again, plenty of centre bounces. Just the scoring isn't there yet. And yeah, what did he score? 55. So I think keep him. I really want to see a 70 plus from him this week. So this week's top picks, I will start with the backline, Riley Hardiman. Don't expect tons from him every week, but get him in your side. He looks the goods. Sam Berry, similar to Hardiman, this was it was a big score, and that should be enough to give him a bit of a chance to keep that spot for the next few weeks. We'll have a look at him. He was playing against a very young West Coast midfield, so I'm not sure that ceiling score is going to be there, but he is worth grabbing. Dylan Stevens, for North, he just looks like he's growing up and he's becoming a really good footballer, and I think the fantasy scores go along with that. I reckon he's worth grabbing to be on that ride. Hunter Clark, so yeah, it's been a long slog if you've owned him, but he's still only 26 years old and still has it in him. As I said before, he just needs to keep his body right, but he's worth a stab. Xavier O'Halloran's the last one. That midfield role has been there for a bit, but now he has a really good score to his name. He's got the forward status, and he's 24 years old. I reckon he's worth a crack as well. So good luck. I hope you can get one of those names in your side, and hopefully they go well. Now, shout out to @Ethan_Prendy. It's Ethan Prendergast on X, who wrote to me during the week about a trade he did that I'll get to a bit later. But he actually said it would be great if I could go a little deeper with the waiver wire pickups. And it's a really good shout out, actually, because I'm sure there are some of you listening who listen to my top 5 waiver wire pickups every week, but play in such a deep league that they're already taken. So Ethan has challenged me to go a bit deeper with the waiver pickups and try and come up with some names that are going to add value and actually be available in those really deep leagues. So I'm going to try it every week, see how I go with it. Let's go deeper with our waiver wires. The first one would be Bailey Banfield, who has a very low ownership at this point. And, he's never really done much as a forward, in terms of fantasy, that is. But as I mentioned earlier, he came on for the injured Simpson and played in the halfback role. I reckon he's worth a crack. Another docker, Carl Warner. Now, I actually mentioned him about a month ago as a pickup, and his scoring has been, unfieldable, to say the least, since. Popped up with another 70 on the weekend, and I still have faith in his ability to become a fantasy player, and I reckon he's worth a crack in leagues where he's probably just sitting there. Bailey Fritsch is the next one. His scoring has been terrible, and he's actually had a really poor season, but just the last 2 or 3 weeks, there was a game, I reckon it might have been the week before this one, where he was the sub for Melbourne. He came on late, third quarter or whatever, and just dominated. And he went on with it last weekend against the Swans. So I reckon he'll be available and a great forward to get in a super deep league. Jacob Constanti is the other one. I talked about him earlier. Not really putting up any scores, but I'm just watching him and I'm just seeing him improve every week, and I think he's going to be a player of the future who'd very likely be available. And then the last one, I'm going to run with Caleb Smith for Richmond. I read some good stuff about him in the preseason, him playing in that halfback Jaden Short style role. Hasn't really eventuated, and his scoring hasn't really been great, but he's just started to look the part on the weekend, and I reckon if you can get in now, get him in your side, it might continue to develop, and you could have yourself a pretty decent scorer there. So how'd I go? 5 much deeper names this week to go with the regular 5 that I did. Yeah, I hope that helps. Some of those leagues where I know I'm in 2 keeper leagues, and one of them is 12 teams, 30-man squad, really highly engaged coaches, and there's just scraps on in the pool. So they're the sort of names that I think would help for leagues like that. Now, the end of round 11 saw the latest edition of dual position players added, the changes added to the formats, depending on which DPPs your league uses. On Keeper Fantasy, you've got the option of using the industry ones, which is what Supercoach, Dream Team, AFL Fantasy use in their classic games, or you can go with the Keeper Fantasy specific DPPs. So you got that choice there. But for those playing with the standard ones that are used across all the formats, we did have some additions, and I thought I'd just run through a few names that certainly took my interest. Connor Rozee gets defender status. What an absolute gift for Rozee owners. It wasn't enough that they already had one of the best primo mids in the game. He's now got defender status, and his scoring is just as good. So, yes, happy days for Rozee owners. Jake Riccardi for the Giants added ruck status. I reckon in some very deep leagues that could be handy at some point. Jack Bowes for Geelong picked up defender status. He's injured at the minute, but geez, he's been a hard watch. I'm not sure if he's ever going to be a consistent scorer, but at the very least, he's got defender status for now. Bailey Williams from the Bulldogs, another handy guy that can score okay on his day. He's got his defender status back. Lockie Sullivan for the Pies picked up forward status. And Justin McInerney for the Swans. He's out suspended at the minute. He had forward status last year, lost it in the summer. He's got it back now, so he could be pretty handy in the second half of the year. And then young Tom Gross for the Eagles also picked up forward status, which caught my eye as well. Now, the AFL has their mid-season draft this week on Wednesday night, which is still such an odd concept, really. But anyway, it's been very successful in recent years, and there's been some pretty good fantasy names to emerge. So it's worth keeping an eye on this draft Wednesday night. The players selected will be added to the competitions. I know Keeper AFL will have it late Wednesday night. I think they'll be in. Not sure when the others will, but certainly before the weekend. And if you play with waivers, they will all be waivers. So pretty exciting. We'll get some new players on AFL lists and some new players for us to look at and talk about in our keeper leagues as well. I'll finish the pod now with a couple of questions from you, the listener. I hope you're enjoying this first season of Finders Keepers. I hope the podcast is bringing value and helping you with your keeper sides from week to week. If you're enjoying it, please make sure you have liked and subscribed wherever you're listening to it. And go and check out the page on X at FindKeepAFL and give that a like as well. So a couple of questions. Daniel Bird at Vulcan Left Hand on X. Hi mate, our league has just had its mandatory mid-season trade period. and I thought you might like some of them to analyse. That's awesome. So I'm wondering if I should have written back to you actually. Let me know, Daniel. Do you have trading throughout the season, or is it locked and then you just have a designated period where it can get done? I think it's a great idea. So he sent through some for me to have a look at. So let's look at some of the trades that went through in this league in their mid-season trade period. Darcy Wilson for Sam Flanders. Wow, there's a couple of interesting seasons for those two. Real high hopes at the start of the year. Darcy Wilson hasn't been terrible. He just perhaps hasn't come on as quickly, maybe as owners had hoped. And Sam Flanders, it's been a real shock to the system. The way he was last year, the scoring and the positions, the roles he had last year compared to this year, where he's playing forward and scoring's been poor. The good thing on both sides is they're both young, particularly Wilson. And as an owner if I was an owner of either of them, I'd be less concerned as a Wilson owner because he's still only in his second year. My concern for Flanders is how well the Suns are playing with him in this stinky half-forward role. So as a trade, I think it's pretty win-win. I mean, Darcy Wilson, I reckon, in the long term is going to be the better player. But it's certainly worth taking a punt on Flanders because if something changes and he does end up in a better role, we know how good he can score. It's a great trade. Next one is Mason Wood and a second round mid-season pick for Marcus Windhager. Yeah, I like that a lot. I reckon Windhager's a real goer. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure why he hasn't been playing on the ball. I think he's going to be a great scorer in that role as the years go on. And Mason Wood's fine. You know, he's got the forward status. He's still pulling out decent scores from time to time. So it sounds like, someone contending brings in Mason Wood and hands off the younger Windhager to a side who might be developing. Mason Redman and Steele Sidebottom for Nick Blakey and Will Phillips. That's pretty juicy. I reckon it'll be a similar story with a contender bringing in Sidebottom, who's in rare form but is quite old and wouldn't have much long in his career left. And Mason Redman's a good get. I reckon he's just plateaued a little the last few years, but he still has a lot of fantasy points in him. For Blakey and Phillips, yeah, I reckon Redman and Sidebottom win that. I like Blakey. I love Blakey. I don't know how strong a scorer he's going to be long term. Maybe 80s his limit. And Will Phillips, I don't know what's happening. What's going to happen with him? He may be one who just finds a new club at the end of the year and that's where he gets his opportunity. I mean, North have given him games, but yeah. Anyway, I reckon Redman and Sidebottom wins that just. Bailey Scott for Melbourne's Van Ruin. Bailey Scott is really weird. He's just dropped off this season. I reckon that's a great trade to get Van Ruin, who I do rate, but I think Bailey Scott, his value is as low as it's ever going to be, and I just am convinced he'll come good at some stage. And then the last one was Dylan Shield for James Warple. That's a really interesting one, and I wonder if that went through before Dylan Shield was omitted last week. But I'd be taking Warple 10 times before Shield. I mean, Shield's got the defender status and has scored okay, but he's out of the side. He's been the sub. Whereas Warple, yeah, he's not the huge primo that maybe we thought he could be years ago, but he's pretty solid and his role is rock solid. And there's a chance he changes clubs at the end of the year, so who knows what that does for his scoring. Great work, Daniel. Thanks for sending those through. Sounds like a busy trade period you guys had, which is good fun indeed. Now to the last one, and it's from Ethan Prendergast, who I mentioned earlier, who had suggested that I go a bit deeper with the waiver wire pickup segment. So he put some trades to me a while ago and he's come back with some more. So let's have a look at what he's got to say. So So he says, hey Jordox, thanks for discussing my trades the other week. I loved hearing the breakdown. I thought I'd reach out again because I followed your advice and sold Caleb Daniel off 2 weeks ago in a package deal. 3 weeks ago it was. So I traded away Daniel, Windhager and Blakey in exchange for Newcomb, Baker and Hayden Young before he got injured. My logic was that Daniel will regress to an 80 average and lose forward status next season. I see Blakey as an 80 average as well, so no real loss in selling high. I'm a big fan of Newcomb for future years as well as now. He's a win now type of player that also strengthens my young core of Ash, Nick Dacos, Golden, Rao, Bergman, Baslenka, and then guys like Jagger, Smith, Sheldrick and Bice. Oh jeez, that is a pretty hot young core right there. Apologies for the long message. I feel it's a trade that could use some context. Currently 8-2 for the season and have scored the most points for the year. So it's time to try and win it all. Love it. Sounds like you're playing the game pretty well there, Ethan. Let's look at the trade itself. So Caleb Daniel, Marcus Windhager and Nick Blakey in exchange for Jai Newcomb, Liam Baker and Hayden Young. Now, obviously that Young injury is painful, but on paper that is a really good trade for you. Caleb Daniel I like, and as a defender next year I think he's going to be perfectly fine. Windhager I do like for the future, and Blakey I think he's probably capped at an 80 average. But to bring in Newcomb and Hayden Young, two very exciting mids for the now, but also for the future. They're both so young still and haven't reached the heights that we're going to see them reach, whatever that may be. Newcomb and Young could end up just being really good 95, 100 guys. But, they're so young. Let's see what they can do. And Liam Baker is, he's pretty handy as well. So the crux of it is you pick up Newcomb and Hayden Young, and really all you're giving up is Caleb Daniel, and his forward status this year. It's a great trade. I think you've done really well. Appreciate you sending me the update and letting me know how things are tracking. Love the look of that young midfield you've got. And thanks heaps for supporting the pod. Really appreciate it. And that will do for another episode of Finders Keepers. It was a big one because, as always, there is just so much to discuss in the wonderful world of keeper leagues that we love so much. I'll be back next week on Tuesday with another episode reviewing round 12. And just a reminder, if you want any of your keeper league trades that have gone through or future trades you're considering, anything to do with the trades, anything to do with keeper leagues in general, if you want me to read it out and analyse it on the podcast, drop me a line on X at FindKeepAFL. You can just post on the wall there, or you can send a private message if you want to pick my brain on something, but maybe you don't want the other coaches in your league to know it's you asking the question. You can always remain anonymous. Have a great week. I hope you get all the players you desire in your waivers, and I hope you have a great round 12 and your teams go gangbusters with some more big scores like on the weekend we just saw. In the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers, and until next time, keep on keeping on.